Hey, everybody. I hope and pray that you're doing well today as we come to our word from the Word. And today, that word is sense. Sense. Now, as you kind of look at that emoji, right, it's a sense of humor, is what we would talk about today. Now, as you read through Genesis 17, you'll see that it's 13 years have passed because Ishmael is now 13 years old. And you have that God comes back to give word to Abram that one, he's going to renew his covenant. He is going to change Abram's name to Abraham, Sarai's name to Sarah, and then he gives them this sign of circumcision for all the males. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever thought about how this would sound to an adult, to 100-year-old man, that yes, now you're going to circumcise yourself, your son, and then all of those who live in your household, including the servants, the slaves, whether you bought one or they were already there with you, and this is the way it's going to be. And then he does say, from this day on, from this time on, then you will do it on the eighth day after they're born. Now, let's be honest, it's a lot easier to perform that on an 8 day old son than it would be on a grown man. Now, without going into too much detail there, the whole point of the sign was not only to set them apart, because some of that was already practiced in the cultures around them. But God had a purpose for it, as He does with everything, and part of it is this sign and symbol of cutting off flesh. Right, it is the idea that the same thing we see in the New Testament, right? That we're casting off the flesh, and sometimes you might would wonder, well, wait a minute, why did He give that sign to the men, but then He gave no sign to the woman? Well, it's because the women would be kind of fall under their husband or their father, depending on their age, right? So a daughter would be seen in the light of her father, and a wife in the light of her husband. So the sign came through the man. We see the headship that happens as God has put it in order. Already, we see that in the beginning. We see it in the New Testament as well, as He reiterates that. But now, here's the thing: you say, well, wait a minute, where's the sense of humor in that? Well, one, it probably wasn't a lot of humor in hearing that. And so you can imagine that Abraham would have had a difficult time um, hearing this and then following through with it. But the sense of humor comes when God tells him that Sarah, his wife, his 90-year-old wife, is going to have a child. And I want you to see what happens in verses 17 and 18 of Genesis 17 today. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Now, there's a couple things here. One, that last part is, that Ishmael may live before you. It's kind of like, God, what about Ishmael? Let him be the one. Let's not try to make this overcomplicated. We already have a son. Let's let him be the promise. Let's let him be the fulfillment. Now, we talked about yesterday and the times that we try to take things into matters into our own hands, and when that gets us into trouble. But the promise was that he was going to have descendants. But in this passage is the first time that you see that God says, no, Sarah is going to be the mother. It's almost like God says, okay, you didn't catch this the first time. I never meant for you to go with Hagar. My intention was for you and your wife to have a child. Now, for those of you that know the story going forward, Sarah also laughs when she hears that she's going to be a mother. But now God rebukes her for her laughter, but yet doesn't rebuke Abraham for his laughter. Now it makes me curious, right? And there again, we just have what's before us. So I try not to read too much into it, but let's also look at the evidence, right? He was not rebuked, but she was. Does that mean that, that Abraham had a right to question God and Sarah didn't? No, I don't think so. But I couldn't help but think about, if you go to the New Testament, you remember the story of Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, when he was told that he was going to be a father, that his wife that was barren and on, uh, I was going to say accelerated, she was advanced in age, that she was going to have a child. He asked a question, but it was a question rooted in disbelief. Mary, a teenager, when she finds out she's going to be the mother of Jesus Christ, she asks a question, how can these things be? I've not been with a man. How can these things be? And she asked a question for information. God rebukes, or the angel rebukes Zacharias, but not Mary. So the difference was in the heart. So I would say, right, let scripture interpret scripture, that if we look to this and that we see that Abraham's faith did not waver in this, that I believe in my sanctified imagination that he had a sense of humor in hearing what God was saying. And it was almost, though, not, can this actually happen? I think he was even in imagining, wow, can you imagine what it would be like for 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman to have a child? For her to have a child at 90 years old. Can you imagine that? And I think some of that sense of humor has to go along with God's plan. How many times have you, let's be honest, how many times have you seen the plans of God work out and you couldn't do anything but laugh and say, man, that was nobody but God? Because nobody else could do that. And I look to that to remind us that sometimes we take ourselves too seriously. Sometimes we take the circumstances too seriously. When the things that God does, that he uses the weak to confound and confuse the wise, that God can use the most abstract things and the most underappreciated things and the most overrated things. Think about the disciples, right? The bottom, I don't want to say the bottom rung of society, but I mean, they were, a lot of his followers were the bottom I mean, you don't include tax collectors and prostitutes, and you're dining with them and eating with them, and then to have these fishermen that were uneducated, and to think that these were going to be the ones that were going to lead the revolution that became the church. And yet that's exactly what happened. And so I think at the same time, we have to look at times to the things that God is doing and laugh. Not in a disrespectful way, not in a way that is from a heart of disbelief. And I believe that's what Sarah, she was laughing as it could not happen. I think Abraham was laughing at the fact of what it was going to look like. And I base that solely on the rebuke that she receives and that he doesn't. Now, today, I would just simply say, do you have a sense of humor when you're looking at God's plans? Do you have a sense of humor to open your eyes to be able to see that God will use, at times, the most unlikely of situations, the most unlikely of people? What's probably one of the number one arguments that we have against God when he calls us to do something? God, you can't use me. I'm a nobody. Remember, Moses tried to use those arguments too. It didn't work for him, and it won't work for you or me either. So today, let's look to God's plan with a joyful heart and excitement about just what tomorrow may bring. God bless you, and I pray you have a great, great day.